This is Sarah, and earlier this week I had mentioned that I am now building a Post-it roller, which is inspired by the game Splatoon and some things that I've done at the shop recently. So in order to lay down a continuous stream of Post-its, I'm going to need to have several pads loaded into my roller edge to edge around its diameter. I also mentioned that I want there to be as little gap between the Post-its once they're placed as possible. This means that how the pads are positioned within the roller will take some meaningful planning. So for my first iteration, I focused on the cartridge itself, specifically the way that the pads load into it. I decided to go with 3 pads for this design so that I would be sticking with degrees and angles that I'm familiar with. So one thing to take note of with the pad of Post-its is that when you curve it like this, the adhesive edge stays nice and flat, while the loose edge kind of arcs outward in a gradual slope. In the first iteration of my cartridge, I overlapped the adhesive edge of one of the pads over the gradual sloping edge of the following pad. This also helped brace it in place. So after I designed this, I decided that I would just put some bearings on the side, shove some pipe through it, and roll it up my wall and back and see if it actually worked all on its own. And of course, it didn't. These Post-its are held onto one another with a lot more force than it takes to actually stick to the wall, so they didn't actually peel themselves off. This just means that my design is going to get a little bit more complicated from here. I realized I was going to have to make some sort of tensioned bar that spanned across my Post-its and helped pluck them off individually while pressing them to the wall. So I started prototyping a quick 3D printed U-bracket that would hold my cartridge while I kind of figured out how this was going to work. So this is my second iteration of the Post-it roller holder. Now it has the scraper bar bit that stretches across the Post-it pad with some tension springs on the side. There are some little rubber feet on here that drag across the topmost Post-it and kind of pluck it up off of the pad. The part that isn't on here yet is kind of a little chunk that'll poke out and slide underneath that individual piece, thus peeling it off of the pad and pressing it onto the wall. Once I attached the first rendition of my cartridge onto the handle with the scraper bar, I learned a few things. The scraper bar is tensioned and will therefore ride on the outmost edge of the cartridge. Since the profile of the sticky notes are flush with the outside edge, this means the bar grinds continuously across the top of the Post-its, which isn't exactly what I want. Also, the outside diameter of my roller isn't exactly round, and it would work a lot better if it was. So taking these two things into account, I adjusted the angle and position of the pads as they load into the cartridge. In the second revision of my cartridge, the outer circular diameter of the roller only eclipses the profile of the pad at the loose edge of the topmost Post-it. So once I assembled the new iteration of my roller, I saw that it worked nicely. It glides up and down the wall like butter, and that's partially because I put some nice rubber hose along the actual diameter of the circular roller itself. But the very crucial part, the separator bar that spans across the Post-its, didn't work quite the way I was anticipating, and the reason for this is because I put it on its own bearings, so it just kind of counter-rotates against the roller and doesn't actually push the Post-it up off of the pad. The part that makes contact with the pads will have to stay in place firmly so that it can push the Post-it up and then jam it on the wall. For the end of this update, it doesn't work yet and I'm going to have to leave it on that note, but I'm hoping that by the time I post my next video, it will be in a state where it functions and I can tell you a little bit about why and how I overcame the problems that I'm having right now. But until then, thank you for watching and I don't know, I'll see you around.